Hey guys, it's Brittany.
And I'm Jeff.
And this is our final podcast with Public Health Social Determinants. So for today's topic, we're going to talk about the relationship between work and health. Both Jeffrey and I have stories that hit home to us, and we're going to share them with you. We'll start off with his story and then move into mine. And the purpose of our stories can really help paint the picture of the relationship between both work and health and how your career can be a determinant of health in terms of sickness, injury, and financial means.
So I'll go first. And my story is about my grandfather, Edward Thompson, also known as Pa. That's what we called him as kids. And he had fibrotic lungs, also known as scarred lungs, and we assumed it was caused by the chemical and metal plants he worked in during the 60s. Because as we know, during the 60s and 70s, they did not wear a lot of protection gear during these times. So to start off with my topic, let me just give you a quick definition of what fibrotic lungs actually means. And this is from the Mayo Clinic. And fibrotic lungs is when there's severe scarring in the lungs and it makes it difficult and or almost impossible to breathe. These scars and thickness, these are just scars and thickness of tissues between the alveoli in your lungs. And it's basically the part of your lungs that holds and obtains oxygen. So when you breathe in, that's what holds it and then obviously puts it in your bloodstream. So if these get scarred or thickened, you can't hold as much oxygen in your lungs as you normally could, and it could really drop your oxygen levels really fast. Sometimes it's hard for doctors to pinpoint what the actual cause of this is, but if they cannot figure it out, this disease becomes idiopathic, and it means it's almost impossible to treat. Sometimes some medicine and therapies can help limit symptoms, but it's still like the almost ultimate way to actually get rid of it, unless if there's an actual specific problem or chemical they can pinpoint that's in your lungs. You'll need an actual lungs transplant to actually be healed from it. And what can cause fibrotic lungs would be really acidic dust, coal dust, certain types of metals and fumes you inhale, and also animal and bird droppings. And symptoms of this obviously would be shortness of breath, a dry cough, fatigue, unexplained weight loss, aching muscles and joints, and also swelling of your joints. So let me just give a quick backstory of my grandfather. My grandfather grew up in Connecticut. He went to Notre Dame, and during his family, he had 6 kids, and he put them all through prep school and had a pretty good affluent life. And he was always very active. As a kid, him and my dad taught me fishing, but as my dad would work, he would always bring me fishing. He would always be moving stuff. He was very strong. He would always walk in the woods like he was hiking. Very, very active person. And growing up, he wanted to be a chemist. He was studying chemistry in college. And he worked in a factory that made certain types of plastics and metals. And obviously, when he first got there, he told me he started at the very bottom. And he said they didn't even wear masks and some not even goggles most of the time. They just mostly wore gloves. And obviously, as he went up in the ranks, he obviously went high because he was able to have a pretty good life, put 6 children through prep school, and also have a farm. So he had a pretty good career there. But it almost makes you think towards the end, after I explained what happened to him, like how the workers who didn't rise up, how exposed they were, and how long it was. So once I never really saw that he had symptoms of this until he got his knee surgery. Then after the surgery, something happened where he couldn't breathe. He had to be placed on oxygen. Then they diagnosed him with this disease. Now, this was idiopathic because they don't know how it happened. In his recent past, he used to be a smoker, but he hasn't smoked in over 30 years before this disease, and he was never a big drinker. And a funny fact is when we were actually, after cleaning up his house, he would get gifts of alcohol in his cabinets, and they would be stacked everywhere. But they're all old, so none of us could drink them. But he was very sick, and eventually this scarring, once he was diagnosed, he was on oxygen, and his levels without oxygen would drop into the low 70s and even 60s in less than 5 minutes. So his ultimate cure was a lung transplant. And this obviously, he couldn't be on the list because he was old and he had a knee surgery, so he didn't qualify. So he ended up dying within 2 years of this disease. And even though it wasn't proven that he got this from the chemicals, I know from the U.S. National Library of Medicine and National Institution of Health, for one example, arsen is a metal, and while this metal is not associated with fibrotic lung-like disease, if you inhale it and if you inhale the dust or fumes, the disease can come through septemic uptake. So basically what that means is you'll be exposed to it for maybe a year, but over time it will develop in your system, and then you won't see bad symptoms till like 10 years from now. So that makes me also put in more perspective of the workers who actually worked in the factory directly with the chemical for like years. My grandfather was really there for only 5 years. And another thing why I know is I think it was from the chemicals was because according to the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety, when they talk about working with heavy with metal chemicals or other toxins, they specifically say all their workers must wear appropriate skin care and also avoid unnecessary contact with chemicals. And one thing they put a huge emphasis on is you have to cover your eyes, protect your respiratory system, so wear the proper mask, and also skin. So I know and obviously the disease was idiopathic, but like you could put a clear rate of how the chemicals probably impacted him down the road. And even though he was an active guy, and like this all was in a span of like months, like this did not happen like over time. So this was obviously in his lungs, and it just took a little bump to like actually show. So that's the story of my grandfather, and now Brittany will share the story of her mother. And yeah.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So let me ask, have you gotten checked for cancer recently? Have you had your checkups? Have your parents? Would you think a healthy woman under the age of 50 would have stage 3 cancer? Yeah, me either. Well, the world we live in today, many more young people are getting terminal illnesses. We might ask why, but it has a lot to do with our exposures, environment, and housing conditions, and so on. Like Chapter 2 in Social Epidemiology states, there are consequences of health, in particular working environments. Many occupations require working in hazardous environments where there's exposure to chemicals, radiation, biological hazards, physical stress, noise, health, unsafe conditions, and other pollutants that are a feature of work. So in 2014, my mom was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer at the age of 44. That's pretty young, and she's a healthy person overall. And interestingly enough, the whole floor of night shift nurses she worked with 20 years ago were all diagnosed with cancer around the same time, which was 20 years later. During the night shift that she worked 20 years ago, the housekeepers would use certain chemicals for cleaning, and those chemicals have been banned for years because it's not safe. The night shift is typically when housekeepers deep clean because there are not as many people in the building. It's likely their exposure to the chemicals has something to do with the saw. They buff the floors during the night, and they strip it with a stripping agent. I asked my mom about this and if she could remember what the name of the chemical was, but she couldn't really remember. The stripping agent was carcinogenic, which means it causes cancer. They changed the product once I knew it was cancer-causing, but they never told the nurses about their exposure to it. They never informed them. So my mom actually heard about it from a nurse in employee health about this, since that same nurse was also an employee with my mom 20 years ago during the night shift. She was so concerned with this because she was one of the nurses, so she wanted to find the links to this. And if my mom wasn't still working there today, she would have never known about it. Since the effects of the exposure took years to see, it's really hard to link. Although hard to prove since it's been that long, it's really the only answer to the question why about 25 nurses got cancer around the same time. Their exposures years ago have made a negative impact years later. 3 of the nurses who worked with my mom during that time have passed away already from cancer, and they were in their 40s. And that's pretty young. So maybe this is why the chemical isn't used anymore. And this makes me realize how your career and the environment of your occupation itself can affect your health, whether you know it or not. This also makes me think of how her life as well as mine would be a lot different if we didn't have the health care that we do. My dad is retired from law enforcement, and he gets really good benefits. He actually gets better benefits than my mom does working in the hospital. Fortunately, our insurance covered her treatment costs, but I look at the numbers and I'm amazed. I really don't understand how people can afford these costs, and not everyone has the same benefits as my family does. According to the American Cancer Society, the average cost of colorectal cancer treatment, which is what my mom had, without any insurance is around $124,000. So you have to keep in mind that after your treatments, you'll still need regular checkups after the treatments. So Dr. Yusuf Safar on AARP's website, he talks about the concept of financial toxicity. He says that financial toxicity refers to the health impact of the cost of cancer treatments. Sometimes people do not follow through with their treatments because they can't afford it. They also feel like they will not get the care they need to treat the cancer because they don't have the money in order to do it. Also, a lot of people go bankrupt when they're trying to afford treatments. It can really be a financial burden for people, and even if you do have health insurance and not the greatest policy, There's still a lot of money involved in this. Also, another thing it makes me think of is when you get sick, you're likely not to work as much. You're going to take a pay cut. My mom is actually technically the breadwinner in our family, and we did struggle a bit, but I know it can be worse for others. My dad has a pension, so we were okay. We got through. I'm really thankful that we were able to get my mom her treatments. She actually got cancer twice in the span of 5 years, so I can really only imagine how different our lives would be if we didn't have the insurance and benefits that we do for my dad's job. Like Shaw states in Chapter 10, those who are worse off in socioeconomic terms have worse health outcomes and higher death rates than those who are better off. This really highlights the issue of healthcare in the United States and how drastically someone's life can change from being sick or injured. Financial issues can cause stress, which then can lead to more health problems. These bills can really change someone's socioeconomic status, which can affect the lives of the children in terms of education and opportunities too. Like Chapter 2 in Social Epidemiology also talks about socioeconomic position and how position in the social hierarchy is related to almost every aspect of life. We can see how this can be a financial burden, and it can really change someone's life and also for their family. Since we're talking about how work can impact one's health, it's also necessary to talk about how work injuries can also really influence health. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, approximately 2.8 million people experienced workplace injuries in 2019. It's common for people who work labor jobs to experience injuries simply because of the nature of their job. They're exposed to heavy machinery or harsh chemicals. However, my mom had an injury being a nurse. She would move patients without help because she was stubborn, and she didn't use any machinery either. And from that, she did something to her back, and it changed her life forever after that. As a nurse, it does take a toll on your body. You're always taking care of others, moving them, cleaning them, doing anything to take care of your patients. Her injury happened about in her 20s, just when she was working the night shift that we just talked about, and she still suffers with the pain of it 25 years later. She can't do anything she used to do. She really can't stand for more than a few hours without excruciating pain. She can't ski anymore, which was her favorite thing to do. She can't lift over 15 pounds, and it's hard for her sometimes to hold a baby. She has trouble getting out of bed sometimes when she overdid it the day before, and really, honestly, she can't live her life the same anymore. This has taken a toll on her overall quality of life, in addition to her cancer. She had to stop doing patient care because of the back pain, and she switched to a supervisor position, which is more administrative, and it's all because of this. And this also makes me think of what's not recorded on the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the mental health aspect associated with the workplace. I know working on the front lines during the pandemic has influenced both of my parents' mental and physical health for the rest of their lives. The burnout's real, and I wonder how the stress of this last year as healthcare workers will impact their health in the years to come. It also makes me think of the people that are now without a job due to work injury. Like Chapter 6 in Social Epidemiology says, one's health might deteriorate more without the enforcement of activity, structure on the day, and not being able to have those social networks. And Chapter 7 says there's really an influence on social relationships and mortality too. And so from our stories, Jeff and I's stories, you can see how one's occupation can be a determinant of health. You may be exposed to harmful chemicals, work in poor conditions, or get hurt on the job like both my mom and Jeffrey's grandfather. All of these things can have lifelong lasting issues, if not fatal itself, which can be both impacting physically and mentally.
Wow, Brittany, that was amazing. Honestly,
Thanks, Jeffrey.
I did not know a lot about that, about like with your mom and your situation. I actually have a lot of questions, but due to time, I'll just keep it pretty simple. Do you think there should be any changes when it comes to workplace injuries and how you would get compensation for that? And also, did your mom's work spot, did they do their best to at least help her out, keep her on the payroll, but without giving her a pay cut, and make sure she was going to get through this? Because she obviously, you can't control if you get sick, especially with something with harsh as cancer. So if you want to just touch up on that.
So for her actual injury, she didn't, report it in a way because she was being stubborn and didn't ask for help and just did it without, because also at that time, like, they were short-staffed a lot, and you couldn't, to wait for another nurse to come in is going to be, a half hour, so she just did it herself. She even said today when I was talking on the phone, they're flipping, flopping patients left and right because she thought she could do it all in her 20s by herself when she was fit. But then when it comes to her being sick, she actually hid it from her work because she didn't want her being sick to hinder any job opportunity for her. So she just started working less and tried to hide it from them because she didn't want it to basically have any effect on her job.
Interesting. All right. Well, obviously your mom's a beast. She likes to work hard, so That's cool.
Of course.
So, yeah, that's awesome. And, yeah, so thank you for listening to us, guys. I hope our stories kind of enlightened you and inspired you and expanded your knowledge about workplace injuries. I'm Jeff Thompson.
And I'm Brittany.
And thank you for listening to our podcast.
Hope you learned something.